Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's August 14th, and we have a lot to talk about. My guest this week is Elizabeth Jameson, an extraordinary artist who's living with progressive MS. Elizabeth is someone who's fully integrated her MS into her art and her art into her MS. But before we get to my conversation with Elizabeth Jameson, there are a few other things that you should know about. Multiple sclerosis is tricky to treat and impossible to cure because we don't know what causes it. In the simplest terms, once science can identify a cause, researchers can clearly understand exactly which physiological triggers need to be pushed or pulled to neutralize that cause. So understanding what causes MS will go a very long way toward making it a more treatable condition and even developing a cure. Well, a team of 3 researchers from Harvard University and the University of Glasgow have published their theory of what causes MS, and their theory manages to check a lot of the boxes when it comes to unifying some of what scientists already know or suspect about multiple sclerosis. The research team believes that MS is a result of 2 different events that have to occur in a specific order to someone who's already genetically susceptible. So let's break this down, but first I'll remind you that this is a hypothesis that's being proposed, not a certainty. In fact, part of the point of stating a hypothesis is to motivate the research community to either prove or disprove it. So we're not talking about what causes MS. We're talking about what this research team is advancing as a theory that requires rigorous testing before embracing it as a fact. Still, when I come across a theory that's been published by a credible source and it reflects a new way or a different way or a more definitive way of looking at the cause of MS, I think it's certainly worth discussing. So this research team is suggesting that MS is a late, rare complication of 2 sequential infections. According to their hypothesis, the first event that occurs is that someone is exposed to a threadworm infection, which is a common infection in children that affects the gut. When a child gets a threadworm infection, their body's immune system responds by producing white blood cells that continue to live in the immune system to fight off future instances of this particular infection. That's how immune systems work. These white blood cells are classified as memory white blood cells because they're programmed to remember the threadworm infection should it try to invade the body again. And the next thing that has to happen is that this same individual is exposed to the Epstein-Barr virus. And even after they recover from this illness, we know that the Epstein-Barr virus continues to hide in the white blood cells. What happens next is that these memory cells start attacking other white blood cells in the body, which we know is the mechanism for MS. And according to Dr. Patrick Kearns of Harvard University, the cure for MS lies in accomplishing 2 things. First, public health officials need to begin aggressive treatment of threadworm in the general population. And second, a drug or vaccine to treat the Epstein-Barr virus must be developed. As I said, this hypothesis is interesting because it checks a lot of the boxes. The information that's already known or suspected about MS. For instance, there's always been a strong suspicion that there's a genetic component to MS. And this theory indicates that a person needs to have a genetic susceptibility. Then There's been a lot of theorizing in the research community that MS is somehow related to the Epstein-Barr virus, and there's been more recent research to suggest that there may be a connection between MS and our gut bacteria. So this hypothesis unifies a lot of different data points and widely held theories about multiple sclerosis. But I'll say it again. Today, it's just a hypothesis, an unproven theory that may never prove true. But this is exactly how science works. They say that Thomas Edison failed 10,000 times in his effort to invent the electric light bulb. And when someone asked him about that, he said that he never considered those 10,000 attempts as failures. He saw them as identifying 10,000 ways not to invent the electric light bulb. But eventually, he found a way that worked. So while it's way too soon to pop the champagne corks, now you have some idea of how science tries to move forward in solving the jigsaw puzzle of MS. And if you'd like to read more about this recently published hypothesis, I'll include a link in today's show notes. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about an artificial intelligence-based data analysis platform that used machine learning to be able to accurately diagnose MS months before it could be diagnosed using the traditional diagnostic tools. Artificial intelligence and the ability of sophisticated computer networks to learn by analyzing large amounts of data and looking for patterns that humans can't see is likely one of the driving forces that's going to move medical research forward over the next several years. And the Australian government has just given a $1.74 million grant to the Sydney Neuroimaging Analysis Centre to fund the development of new medical imaging techniques based on artificial intelligence. In collaboration with the University of Sydney's Brain and Mind Centre, the project will focus on diagnostic imaging to detect MS and other neurological disorders. The University of Sydney estimates that MRI and CT scans are misread about 4% of the time. Having these scans analyzed by the proposed system will not only increase the accuracy, but also increase the speed in analyzing a scan and even lead to lower overall healthcare costs. I think it's always inspiring to witness science creating the future. And this project ultimately means faster, better, more accurate diagnosing of MS and other neurological disorders, which means that treatment can begin sooner and someone's quality of life can be preserved longer. Not too long ago, we dedicated an episode of RealTalk MS to look at stem cell therapy and MS. And one of the things that I talked about was the unfortunate reality that there are people out there who are financially profiting from someone's desperate effort to treat their multiple sclerosis. This isn't only true when it comes to those less than reputable stem cell clinics. It's something that's out there, and it's a situation that requires each of us to become informed medical consumers. Because when you're not informed, you leave yourself open to be taken advantage of by people who are highly skilled at preying on the fear and desperation that can accompany a chronic illness like MS. The Medical Board of California has begun proceedings that could lead to the suspension or even the revocation of the license to practice medicine from Dr. Michael Arlotta, whose practice, known as Synergy Health Concepts in Newport Beach, California, specialized in providing an unproven vein opening procedure for MS patients. The procedure is very similar to the CCSVI treatment for MS that's already been labeled a failure by the doctor who originally identified it. Dr. Arlotta broke enough rules to come under the scrutiny of the FDA for repeatedly failing to follow the appropriate protocols in a clinical trial, including getting the necessary informed consent from his patients. But the California Medical Board's 14-page document accuses Dr. Arlotta of much more. It accuses him of gross negligence, repeated negligent acts, dishonesty or corruption, failure to maintain adequate records, and unprofessional conduct. And the medical board provides the details of one case in particular, and I think it's a perfect example of how medical fraud works. First, keep in mind, this was not some shady-looking back-alley medical practice. Dr. Arlotta's practice was in the upscale community of Newport Beach, and Dr. Arlotta displayed what appeared to be outstanding credentials, having attended medical school at University of California, San Francisco, completing a fellowship at Penn State, doing his residency at Duke, and following all of that with a 20-year career as an interventional radiologist. All of that sounds pretty impressive, and it must have sounded that way to the 71-year-old woman who was living with MS when she came to see Dr. Arlotta in late 2014. Dr. Arlotta advised the woman that her treatment, and I want to remind you again, this is a treatment without any scientific foundation. Well, he told her treatment would cost $13,000, which would be covered by Medicare and the woman's private secondary insurance. She was asked for a $1,000 deposit, which she paid. Then in January 2015, the woman was asked for another $2,000 to add to that deposit. Well, she refused to pay that, and the procedure was done later that same month. Afterward, Dr. Arlotta told the woman that eventually all of his patients saw improvements in their MS symptoms. The day after the procedure, the woman returned to Dr. Arlotta's office for a follow-up visit where he proclaimed the procedure had been a success. And he also told her that many of his patients who had gone through this same procedure saw even better outcomes if they also opted for a stem cell therapy treatment. Dr. Arlotta told the woman that she could have that stem cell treatment the very next day for $10,000. And if you've listened to the episode we did about stem cell therapy in MS, then you already know this was a scam. Well, as it happened, the woman turned down the stem cell treatment, even after the doctor dropped the price and told her he'd do it for just $6,000. But let's fast forward 6 months. So now it's June 2015, and the woman receives a bill from Dr. Arlotta for $16,000. Now, this was for the original treatment that was supposed to cost $13,000 and would be fully covered by Medicare and her private secondary insurance. Well, the woman contacted Medicare and her secondary insurance company to see what had already been paid. And it turns out that Dr. Arlotta had billed Medicare $113,000 and then billed her private insurance for another $47,000. And the punchline here, of course, is that since the procedure was done, the woman has experienced absolutely no improvement in any of her MS symptoms. And that paints a pretty accurate picture of how medical fraud works and what it looks like. The perpetrator here didn't look like a bad guy because, unfortunately, the bad guys don't always wear black hats. This was a highly credentialed, highly experienced physician with a practice in a high-income community offering to take away all the pain and suffering that this 71-year-old woman wanted so desperately to leave behind. Instead, it cost her her time and her money and stress and anxiety, and it could have cost her much more. A young Canadian woman with MS died after traveling to Newport Beach in 2011 for Dr. Arlotta's procedure. She learned about the procedure by attending a seminar he gave in a hotel ballroom. So the takeaway here is simple. You need to do your homework. You need to be an informed medical consumer, because when you're not, you run the risk of becoming someone's victim. And unfortunately, we never know we're being scammed by a professional until we see it all in the rearview mirror. And by then, it's too late to do much about it except count up your losses. A market research company is looking for people diagnosed with primary progressive MS to participate in an online study. Participants will be asked to complete an online survey that can only be completed on a Windows-based computer. The survey will take approximately 1 hour to complete, and the participants in the study will be compensated. If you're interested in finding out more about this study, you can contact Bridget Adele at Solutions Market Research. By phone, it's area code 815-744-7950, or you can email Bridget at bridget.adele@solutionsmarketresearch.com. And if you choose to email, please include your phone number. They say that the left side of our brain is the logical side. It's the math and science side. And the right side of our brain is responsible for our creativity. It's the artistic side. My guest today is the renowned artist Elizabeth Jameson. And while MS may have impacted Elizabeth's brain, it's pretty apparent that both sides of her brain are working quite well together. In a moment, we'll talk with Elizabeth Jameson about how and why her work is often described as representing the intersection of science and art. When you visit her website, and you'll find a link to it in today's show notes, it says that Elizabeth Jameson is an artist who specializes in the intersection of art and science. Since being diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, Elizabeth has transformed her brain MRI scans into remarkable and provocative images that challenge how we view the brain, disability, and illness. Elizabeth's work is part of the permanent collections at the National Institutes of Health, the Multiple Sclerosis Center at Yale University, the Shepherd Center in Atlanta, the John Paul II MS Rehabilitation Center in Poland, the Center for Brain Science at Harvard University, the MS Clinic at the University of California, San Francisco, and many, many more venues throughout the world. Her art even serves as the cover design for the second edition of the Primer on Multiple Sclerosis, which is the reference manual for practicing clinical neurologists. Now, in addition to creating her amazing artwork, Elizabeth is an e-patient scholar and advisor to Stanford Medicine X, and she's written extensively about patient-centered healthcare, design, and the arts in her blog, which is a very worthwhile read. Welcome to the podcast, Elizabeth.
Hi, nice to be talking with you.
Bridging art and neuroscience is just a really interesting and I would say unique mission. I'd say that your work actually reflects the intersection of art and science. But what does that mean to you? What does it mean for an artist to stand at the intersection of art and science?
Well, I would like to go back to why I'm doing art in the first place. I was a lawyer, courtroom lawyer, and my MS kept progressing to the point where I no longer felt comfortable speaking in the courtroom, and I ended up being an artist sort of by default. And I was trying to figure out something to do with my life, and I somehow bumped into a neighborhood art class. I fell in love, absolutely fell in love with art for some reason, and never looked back. And I thought, what should be the meaning of my life? Because I used to be public interest lawyer representing prisoners and people in inner cities. And I thought, what can I do for MS with my MS? And I looked around my office, found a stack of brain scans, and I thought, oh, these are ugly. I don't want to look at them. They were really tattooed permanently on my forehead. So the best way I could talk about my MRIs, because to me that was the symbol of my MS. And I really thought they were disturbing and ugly images. And I didn't want to see myself as ugly and disturbing. So I said, why don't I go into my art practice and transform the images? So it was a project that was very personal to me, is how to make myself feel beautiful and interesting. And that's how it all began, to the practice I'm now into, which is much wider scoped. And so I really find I just love entering in the neurotechnology lab and talking to neurologists and neuroscientists to see what else I could do to make neuroscience and the images that they come up with and make them to reflect the humanity behind the images.
You know, I was reading an interview that you had done a while back, and you mentioned that there was a psychological impact on people who have their MRIs done, which I think is something you kind of just walked us through a little bit in your example. Since an MRI exam is pretty standard for everyone living with MS, I thought we should talk about that for a minute.
Sure.
You said that because an MRI was such an invasive procedure, patients needed to develop narratives and take ownership of the data. I'm just wondering what you might suggest. How does someone who might not be quite so artistically inclined go about developing that narrative?
It's such a great question, because I think a lot of people would describe themselves as not artistic. They're not artistic. They don't want to be artistic, and they don't know what to do with the experience of illness. The MRI is less benign than what we're all told. Personally, I've had so many MRIs, I fall asleep. But my first MRIs were really, it's an experience close to death, in the sense you go into a dark tunnel where you can't see anything. That's sensory deprived. And then there are loud, horrible noises. And it's the closest thing to a coffin. And I think I don't feel that way now, but I think we all need to know that and recognize that's our rite of passage. And to ignore or diminish the impact of the MRI is not doing ourselves service to the courage and the psychological tunnel we all go through when we're talking about chronic illness.
So you're choosing to embrace the experience and find a way to translate it and make it something that it can be embraced, as opposed to denial.
Right. Then I don't like the term denial. Just so hard to process chronic illness, and some denial is really good. You don't want to sit. You don't want to sit in the discomfort of the side effects of chronic illness, which is having to do such things as injections or MRIs. But my philosophy has always been MS is fascinating. It's interesting. And those of us who are living our lives, we have a lot to say. Some of us are artists. Most of us aren't artists. But it's all an all-encompassing experience of chronic illness. And our society oftentimes doesn't allow us to fully understand how interesting the experience is. There are reactions that we all should seek out and discuss and think about, be thoughtful about. And you don't need to be an artist to do that. It helps, I think. But when I ask friends who have MS or cancer, do you think your approach to your illness is creative? They say, no, I'm not creative. And when I look at how they've coped so beautifully with their illness, it involved enormous creativity.
That kind of leads me to something else I wanted to ask you about. I know that you gave a talk at TEDx Stanford. It was entitled Learning to Embrace and Celebrate Our Imperfect Bodies, which kind of follows what you were just talking about. So what does that mean, to embrace and to celebrate imperfect bodies?
Well, we all have imperfect bodies. Whether you're a model or you work out every day or you're just a regular, normal person, we all have imperfect bodies because we're all going to die. We're all going to get sick. We're all going to get colds. And why don't we look at it and see what's fascinating about the experience? Whether it's cancer or MS, it's just for those diseases or other very serious diseases. There's a lot to be learned. And instead of being isolated and exclusively depressed, there are other emotions when we think about it that are really interesting and worth delving into, which I think leads us to recognize if we don't celebrate our lives, no matter how the life we don't want to live, but we have to live in, then why not find ways of celebrating it? Why not find ways of, for example, looking at your MRIs and finding something really interesting and demand at a dinner party to say, look, I want to talk about my MRIs. I'm going to bring copies of my MRIs to all the dinner party guests. Let's just talk about what does it mean to have digitalized components of our brain, and to say it's great to have dinner parties where we can talk about disease and illness. We can all learn from it. It's just darn interesting.
Well, I think that having the wherewithal to want to have that dinner party or be at that dinner party where that's the conversation that we're having, I think it assumes or requires that you own your situation, whatever that health status might be. That's kind of the first step before you can even share something. And I think that kind of speaks to what the e-patient program is all about at Stanford. I mentioned when I introduced you that you're also an e-patient scholar and advisor. I'm wondering if you could explain, because I know there are a lot of people listening who aren't yet familiar with that terminology. And what does it mean to be an e-patient?
Oh, what a great question. I'm learning. We're all learning. Basically, I think for me, it means to complain less and be more active. And my example of being an e-patient and my courage to confront this issue of loneliness and isolation and waiting rooms that we all spend so many times waiting in our subspecialty offices. I have a progressive illness, MS, so I'm always sitting in my urologist waiting with my speech therapist, physical therapist, etc., as well as my neurologist. And I realized we don't talk to each other. We don't communicate with each other. There's really no way to really connect with each other. And so I've been trying to do something about it. And my office is trying to develop ways where we can have conversation cards, where we can talk to each other or write our thoughts in the waiting room. This is a really small example of being an e-patient, but it's the basis of we have a responsibility and duty to really change the care that we're not getting. And we can make some of it happen, hopefully. And also, I think we, e-patients, need to coexist with e-physicians or e-nurses. Because the battle of accepting and celebrating illness is with our physicians and with our nurses, because they get lonely and depressed also. I think we have to work hand in hand in trying to find what we're doing interesting, exciting, and we have a need for credible partnership. And I'm really for breaking down walls between patient and professional staff. And that's my idea of e-patient. The other e-patients are writing extensively in podcasts and in their own writings, publications. But what does it mean to be ill? What does it mean to be fed if you're quadriplegic or in a wheelchair? What does that mean? What's that experience? Going to a symphony and going to a symphony in a wheelchair. What does it mean to have someone feed you if you're a quadriplegic? And it's interesting, and there's really funny things that come about from people really looking at disability. It's not all negative, depressing stuff. I find a lot of our lives are really funny, and the more disabled I become, the more I've relaxed into the humorous aspects of illness, as well as the fascinating journey of trying to understand a very, very complex disease. The other thing, as an patient, I really would love in my next lifetime is to really work on breast tumors. As breast cancer is a huge issue for people who are living right now, women in the United States. And I would love to use art as a way to make breast tumors fascinating, so every woman could have a copy of their tumors if they want.
Well, I think you've just posed some really, really important questions. You've made some, I just think this has been one of the more remarkable conversations I've had the privilege of being a part of. So I want to thank you for that. And I also want to thank you for, I think what I'm going to label, if you don't mind to label, the creative activism that you pursue. I love the way you have been able to find a way to use art and design to really expand the narrative of illness, just as we were talking about earlier. Everything we've talked about has certainly illustrated how you go about doing that. And we're going to have links to the video of your TEDx talk, your website, and your blog all in today's show notes. And I would really encourage our listeners to spend some time watching that video, listening to what you have to say, taking in your art. That would be time extremely well spent. Thank you, Elizabeth Jameson, for talking with us today.
Oh, it's my honor.
Before we wrap things up, I want to say thank you to everyone who sent me an email or messaged me on Twitter with suggestions or ideas about what you'd like to hear in future episodes of Real Talk MS. If you have any feedback that you'd like to share and you haven't shared it yet, please email me at john@realtalkms.com. That's JON@realtalkms.com. Or if it's easier, just head over to our website at realtalkms.com and fill out the form on the Contact Us page. Your suggestions and feedback are important to me, and they're always welcome, so I hope you'll get in touch. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.